So one of the claims of postmodernism is that there's no meta-narrative. And you and I have talked a fair bit about the fractal structure of narrative. And I talked to Carl Friston about object perception itself. And I asked him if he thought that the perception of an object was a narrative in and of itself. And he said yes.
Yeah.
And that's associated with the notion that when you see an object, you're actually perceiving something like its functional utility and not its objective qualities, let's say.
Yeah.
And so it's narratives all the way down, right, to the very basis of what you would perceive as a singular object. So even the concept of perceptual unity is narrative in structure. And if that's true, then the postmodernist idea that there's no grand unifying narrative is an argument of convenience, because what the postmodernists essentially do is allow the narrative to be fragmented to the point that's maximally convenient for whatever the hell they're up to, and say, well, there's nothing above this. Yeah, well, that's very convenient, guys, but everything. So without a unifying narrative, you have fragmentation and disunity, and it's associated neuropsychologically with anxiety and hopelessness. And so,
but what's great about the fairy tales is that they actually deal with that exactly. So in one way, what you could say is that the basic story structure, Campbell had this whole hero's journey, which is powerful, and I think he captures something real. But you can reduce the story to basic one move, right? Like down and up. Mm-hmm. Basically, problem, and then dealing with the problem, right? Situation, problem, or question, and then dealing with the question. Yeah. And that can help us understand why it's related to object perception, because that's what it is, right? You don't do it consciously, but you're constantly kind of asking what's important, what's relevant. And you can imagine when you see something that you don't know what it is, it's a crisis, especially if it's coming at you in a way. Mm-hmm. You have to answer that question, and it's a life or death. It can be a life or death situation. You end up in a place where you don't know what's happening, you don't know what's coming towards you, and you have to answer that. And I think the story the basic story pattern captured that, and the fairy tales, most of them, they capture that very much. Because, for example, Snow White, which we're telling now, it has that story. So Snow White, things happen to her. She ends up, something changes, and then she ends up in the forest, with these little monsters,
with dwarf men.
That's right.
Yeah, that's the eternal predicament of women, is to be surrounded by dwarfed men.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But you can understand it. It has multiple levels, but you can understand as the very transformation of a young woman. It does have to do with puberty. Snow White pretty much has to do with puberty. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on there, is that as she reaches puberty, she deals with all the problems of puberty, you could say, or that transformation. It's a question. What the hell is happening to me? Like, what is going on? And I don't have the answer. And especially for a young woman, this cycle of menstruation, it's annoying and it's painful, and what is this? Like, why what is happening to me? And so the story of Snow White has this moment where as she becomes possible, she comes into competition with the queen, right? She comes to the moment where she can now be in competition with the queen.
Right.
Then she goes into the woods, into the space of chaos, but then she also, she falls in with men that can't be her mate. Idiosyncrasies of masculinity.
Say that again.
Idiosyncrasies of masculinity. All the things about masculinity that are kind of annoying, like in Disney captures it really well,
with the various
the kind of grouchy, and like there's all these different kind of aspects of masculinity.
Yeah, they're not united.
Exactly.
Yeah, so those are you can think about each of those dwarfs as the embodiment of a fragmentary narrative.
Exactly,
right?
a fragmentary,
a micro narrative that isn't the print. If you could mix all the dwarfs together and extract out the best, you'd have a prince.
Exactly. That's right. That's the right way to see it. And then Snow White gets caught in that world, and then she has to learn, especially for a traditional worldview, she has to learn the job of a woman, right? She has to learn to clean and to cook and to do that. And it's like, what is this for? Like, she gets all the problems.
And that's in the service to those dwarves, too, weirdly enough. That's also the plaint of modern women, too, is that I'm doing all this cooking and cleaning for nothing but dwarves.
That's right, exactly. Mm-hmm. And so then, obviously that all leads to her dying, you could say, or falling asleep. There are many iterations of her falling asleep in the story. They're all related, right? She falls asleep and then she's woken up by dwarves, which is like,
right.
That's not
Why
going to do
wake
it.
up at all?
That's not going to do it. And then, work and learn to clean and do all that stuff and kind of live in the forest. And then ultimately that leads to her second falling asleep and then being woken up by the right mate. And so the solution, then she finds the reason for all of this. So what's the reason for this cycle of transformation? What's the reason for all these changes in her body, in her life, as she's kind of in that transition, and then finding her mate, basically finding her husband, finding her prince, that answers the question.
So do you think as well, in Sleeping Beauty, of course, the princess is woken up by a kiss from the right mate too.
Yeah.
But I always thought that it was useful to read that story on two levels simultaneously. What a woman in fortunate circumstances is going to find the proper mate, but at the same time, she's going to awaken the part of her that's capable of a heroic quest as well, and to integrate that. And so that waking up as a consequence of being kissed by the prince is also, what would you say, integrating that capacity for, I would say, heroic adventure into the feminine role.
Yeah.
Right? So you want to find that in a man, but you also want to find that in your
woman.
own.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, well, so, I was talking to my daughter-in-law the other day about my son and her have we've all got together and bought a building to put this new corporation we're working on in, and she's off to work. And she has a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old and is feeling some separation from them. And one of the things we talked through is the fact that it's perfectly reasonable for her to go to work, assuming your children are also being cared for, because it's very important for her to model to her children the fact that adults have important adult activity to engage in. Partly because the children have to see that because they're going to be adults, or they end up in the Peter Pan world, right? It's like, well, why would I give up the pleasures of childhood to undertake the responsibilities of adulthood if there's nothing of value in that? And it seems perfectly reasonable to me that adult women can model adult behavior as well as taking care of children. And we know too that if you look at the best predictors of, well, here's a couple of different facts. The educational attainment of a mother predicts the educational attainment of children over and above the IQs of the mother and father. The father's educational attainment doesn't, right? So that's weird and interesting. And then countries that value female education and emancipate women do way better on the economic front. And I think it's probably because there's not much difference between, let's say, opening your culture up to the contributions of women and opening your culture up to new ideas and diverse, what would you say, a diverse range of contributions from various sources. That constraint of women seems to go along with a constraint on idea and flexibility in general.
No, definitely. I mean, you can see that it's in the fairy tales, you can see that all of these moments, they have to do with change. They have to do with something happens, there's a change, and then I have to find the meaning of that change. I have to find the solution, right? I have to find a way out so that the change now finds a resolution and makes sense. And you can
so Piaget talked about that too in terms of a stage transition, and his hypothesis, and this has been also, what would you say, taken up in a parallel way by philosophers of science, is that you have a mode of interpreting the world which enables you to progress in the world until its insufficiency is demonstrated, and that can happen as a consequence of biological maturations, right? The framework that you used as a child is no longer relevant because the physiological acts that you're capable of now have radically transformed. That would happen at puberty. So that viewpoint has to be radically transformed to take into account the new reality, but the new transformation has to do everything the old viewpoint did, plus something additional.
Yeah.
So there's actually, it's not merely the reestablishment of a new kind of stasis, it's a more inclusive interpretive framework. This is why there's actual progress, let's say, in science, but maybe also progress on the moral front, is that it isn't merely that you're looking at things in a different way. you're looking at things in a way that now takes more into account and still enables you to exert a certain amount of prediction and control.
Yeah, definitely.